Hello everybody, been a while hasn't it? Well, I'm back and I've got an important message for all of you. Across classrooms, locker rooms, dinner tables, and state houses, there is only one truth that echoes louder than any argument. Transgender people are not an idea to be debated. They are human beings asking for the same dignity that all the rest of us often take for granted. To speak about transgender rights is to speak about something that goes deeper than politics. It is to speak about belonging, about safety, and about the quiet, sacred right to exist without fear. For several transgender and gender diverse people, especially teens, life begins with a question they did not choose. Who am I allowed to be? While other young people are encouraged to dream about grand futures full of possibility, transgender youth often have to fight simply to be recognized, to have their names spoken correctly, and to see themselves reflected honestly in school records, to walk into a restroom without calculating risk. Now, these are not mere luxuries. They are daily routines that determine whether a person feels human or erased. Inclusion is not about special treatment, guys. It is about removing unnecessary suffering. Research consistently shows that whenever transgender youth are affirmed, when their names and their pronouns are respected, when they are supported by family and the community alike, their mental health outcomes improve dramatically. The difference between rejection and acceptance can be life-changing. Sometimes it can even be life-saving. A supportive teacher, a parent that listens, a friend that stands up for them no matter what. These small acts can ripple outward in ways that we may never fully see. Yet, fear often drives resistance. Fear of change, fear of misunderstanding, fear that inclusion somehow subtracts from others. But rights are not pie slices, guys. Expanding protection and dignity does not diminish anyone else's humanity. It strengthens the fabric of a society that claims to value freedom. Now, at its heart, the movement for transgender rights is part of a long lineage of struggles for civil rights, for the fight against racial segregation to the battle for marriage equality. History shows us something very important. Inclusion always feels radical to those accustomed to exclusion, but in hindsight, justice rarely looks extreme. It only looks all the more obvious. We must also recognize that transgender people are not a monolith. They are artists and athletes and scientists and siblings and veterans, mothers and fathers, students, and even leaders. They exist in every race, religion, and region of the world. Their lives contain joy and humor and ambition and complexity far beyond the narrow narratives often imposed upon them. And to advocate for transgender inclusion, like I am now, means advocating for policies that protect people from discrimination in housing, employment, healthcare, and education. It means ensuring schools are safe spaces for all students that attend it. It means listening to transgender voices instead of speaking over them. And it means acknowledging that no one understands their identity more intimately than the person living it. But beyond policy, inclusion begins in the everyday. It begins when we correct someone gently but firmly after misgendering. It begins when we choose curiosity over straight cruelty. It begins when we teach young people that difference is not danger. The measure of a society is not how it treats the powerful, but how it treats those who are most vulnerable. Transgender people, especially the youth, deserve more than mere survival. They deserve the chance to thrive and succeed and live as all the rest of them do. And thriving requires more tolerance alone, for tolerance is passive. It merely endures. Inclusion is active. It celebrates and it protects and it makes room. The future will remember how we responded to this very moment. Whether we choose fear or compassion, whether we protected our children or politicized them, whether we widened the circle of belonging or guarded it closely against them. Every generation is given a test at some point or another. Ours asks a very simple question with profound consequences. Will we honor the full humanity of transgender people? The answer to this question, my friends, will shape not only their lives, but the moral character of our own. This will lead me into chapter 1 of this series that I will be doing. Understanding transgender identity is not political, it is merely human. Let's start with a story about a girl. The first time that anyone argued about her existence, she was sitting in math class. Her pencil hovered above a worksheet that she could no longer read. The numbers had blurred together, but not because they were difficult for her, because the whispers behind her back had been that much louder. Someone had used her name, not the one she had chosen for herself, but the one printed on attendance sheets. A few snickers had followed, and a teacher hesitated. The room had shifted in that subtle way that rooms do whenever something unusual has been suddenly acknowledged. She was only 14. Now, at 14, most children worry about their grades or their friendships or acne or whether their crush has noticed them in the hallway before class starts. She, however, worried about whether asking to be called by the right name would cost her safety, whether correcting someone would make her a target, whether existing honestly was even worth the risk at all. That afternoon, somewhere far from her classroom, adults debated people like her on the television. Pundits used words like ideology, agenda, controversy. Lawmakers drafted policies about bathrooms and sports and medical care. Comment sections on social media filled with cruel certainty from strangers halfway around the world who never sat in that very classroom with her and never felt their own name turned into a weapon. No one in those debates mentioned the way that her hand shook when attendance began. No one described the exhaustion of bracing yourself for laughter. No one talked about how it feels to hold your breath in a room full of people because the smallest correction, actually, I use she, her, might change how they look at you forever. Before transgender identity became a headline, it was a lived human experience. Before it became a political battleground, it was just a quiet realization, often frightening, often confusing, often deeply clarifying, that the person you are inside does not match the label written on your damn birth certificate. To be transgender is not to just wake up one day seeking attention. It is not a trend absorbed through phone screens. It is not a rebellion for rebellion's sake. It is only the steady, sometimes painful knowledge that authenticity and safety do not always arrive together. For several, this realization comes in small moments, standing in front of a mirror and feeling like the reflection is slightly misaligned, hearing a different name and feeling an unexpected warmth, imagining a future self, and recognizing something that just feels right. These particular moments are rarely dramatic at all. They are often private, and they are occasionally pretty sacred. Yet, the world treats them as public fucking property. This series that I am doing is not an argument being shouted across a great divide. It is not an attempt to win a culture war either. It is merely a return to the human scale of this conversation. Because beneath the policies, beneath the headlines, beneath the fear and the misinformation, there are young people sitting in classrooms right this very moment with shaking hands. There are parents out there trying to understand. There are adults remembering what it felt like to grow up completely unseen. Understanding transgender identity requires more than definitions. It requires listening. It requires humility. It requires acknowledging that dignity is not conditional. The inclusion is often framed as a kind of concession, something that is given quite reluctantly. But for transgender people, inclusion is oxygen. It is the difference between surviving and actually living your life. Extensive research from organizations such as the American Psychological Association consistently shows that affirmation and support dramatically improves mental health outcomes for transgender youth. Rejection and hostility do the opposite. Now, these are not just abstract statistics, you guys. They are measurable consequences of how we choose to treat one another as human beings. And this is why it all matters so fucking much. Because gender is new. Not because society is collapsing around us. And not because traditions are under attack. It matters because there are children learning to measure their words before they speak them. Because there are teenagers deciding whether honesty is worth a life of isolation. Because there are adults that still carry the scars of growing up without a language for who they really were. It matters because every single human being deserves the radical safety of being known, not punished or crucified for it. The story of transgender identity is not about confusion. It is strictly about courage. The courage to say quietly or loudly, "This is who I am," in a world that may not yet understand what exactly that really means. So my little essay begins here, not in outrage or in accusation of any kind, but in a small classroom with a pencil hovering above a worksheet and a young person wondering whether the world will make space for her truth. The problem is that transgender people are not invisible. It is that they are visible in all the wrong ways. Transgender people are discussed endlessly today in legislative chambers, on talk shows, in school board meetings, in viral social media posts, which are often filled with half-truths and lies. Their lives are dissected, analyzed, and framed as cautionary tales or cultural symbols. Entire elections have been influenced by arguments about their very existence. Entire platforms have been built on opposing them. And yet, in the middle of all that noise and nonsense, transgender people themselves are rarely the ones holding the fucking microphone. They are being talked about as ideas. They are being talked about as threats. They are being talked about as trends. They are being talked about as human tragedies. But they are not often invited to speak for themselves as experts of their own experiences. Someone stands up and debates whether transgender youth really understand who they are. The young person at the center of that debate is rarely asked what understanding even fucking feels like. When policies are drafted restricting medical care, lawmakers do not always sit down with the families whose lives will be reshaped by those very decisions. When commentators question whether affirming a child's identity is too much, they seldom ask that child what it costs to be denied so much. It is much easier to argue about abstractions than to listen to actual people, isn't it? Listening requires slowing down. It requires admitting that we might not already know everything that we think we do about the situation. It requires recognizing that lived experience carries a kind of authority that statistics alone cannot accurately provide us. But public conversations often reward certainty, not curiosity. As such, transgender identity has become a symbol onto which broader anxieties are projected. changing gender roles, parenting, social media, cultural shifts that feel rapid and destabilizing. But instead of asking transgender people who they are, society sometimes uses them as shorthand for everything that it fears as a collective whole. This pattern is nothing new, however. Throughout history, marginalized groups of people have been transformed into symbols before they were ever treated as neighbors. But knowing that something is historical does not necessarily make it any less painful in the present time. Now, imagine hearing strangers debate whether your sense of self is real or not. Imagine watching a panel of adults sit and speculate about your motives. Imagine hearing your identity described as confusion, delirium, delusion, or a fucking contagion, without anyone asking how long you have wrestled with it in private, how many nights you have lain awake turning it over and over in your mind. The gap between being discussed and being heard is the gap between object and real-life human being. And transgender people are reduced to policy problems. Their entire humanity becomes secondary to none. Conversations shift drastically from, how do we support this person, to, how do we manage this issue? The language changes quite subtly, but the impact is quite profound indeed. It sends a message. You are not the subject of your own story. You are just the topic. And topics can be controlled, whereas stories must be respected. Listening does not mean unquestioning agreement, though. It simply means beginning with the assumption that the person speaking knows something essential about their own damn life. It means recognizing that identity is not a theory to be solved, but a reality to be understood. In classrooms, in homes, in clinics, and in communities everywhere, listening greatly changes outcomes. Studies consistently show that transgender youth who feel heard and affirmed experience significantly lower rates of depression and anxiety. Organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics have emphasized that supportive environments are not at all indulgent. They are protective. They are life-saving in quiet, measurable ways. But support begins with listening. It begins with asking gently, can you tell me what this feels like? It begins with resisting the urge to respond immediately and instead allowing someone to finish their story. For a lot of transgender people, the first time they are truly listened to is not in a public forum or in a courtroom. It is inside a therapist's office, or in a late-night conversation with a close friend, or in the quiet relief of a parent who says, I don't fully understand this yet, but I love you anyway. That moment, that shift from debate to attention, it can feel like stepping out of a storm. Because to be heard at all is to be recognized as real. And reality should never require a vote. When transgender people ask for inclusion, they are not asking to dominate the entire conversation. They are asking to just participate in it. They are asking for their experiences to be considered primary evidence. They are asking for space to describe their own lives without being interrupted by assumptions. Inclusion begins not with policy and mandate, but with posture. Are we leaning in to understand this person before me? Or are we leaning back, prepared to argue without understanding? The difference between these two positions determines whether the conversation about transgender identity will remain loud or divisive, or will it become something quieter and braver and far more humane? Because the truth is this, guys. Transgender people have been talking all along. The question is whether we are willing to listen. Misunderstanding is often treated as harmless, a difference of opinion or a generational gap. It is even a simple matter of seeing both sides. But when the subject of misunderstanding is someone's identity, their most intimate sense of self, the cost is not abstract. It settles into bodies, it lingers in the nervous system, and it shapes entire futures. For transgender people, misunderstanding is rarely neutral. It can begin quietly. A parent dismisses a child's words as a phase. A teacher avoids using the right name because it just feels inconvenient to do so. A doctor hesitates. Each moment may seem small on its own, but small refusals accumulate, and they form a pattern. And patterns become environments. We're in an environment where identity is constantly questioned. A person learns to question themselves. Even certainty begins to feel quite fragile when it is met with skepticism at every turn. Self-trust erodes, joy becomes more cautious, authenticity feels too much like a risk. For young people especially, misunderstanding can distort the already difficult terrain of adolescence. Teen years are a time of becoming, of testing identities, imagining futures, discovering where you belong in a functioning society. When a transgender teen is told that their understanding of themselves is invalid, that exploration is not merely complicated, it is completely obstructed. Imagine learning that parts of you must remain hidden to be safe. Imagine calculating which version of yourself is acceptable in every room that you step inside of. Imagine hearing your own name, the one that feels true, treated as negotiable. There is not a theoretical discomfort here. Research has repeatedly shown that rejection and invalidation are associated with higher levels of depression, anxiety, and isolation among transgender youth. Conversely, affirmation and acceptance significantly improve mental health outcomes. Organizations such as the American Psychological Association have emphasized that social support is one of the strongest protective factors for transgender individuals, as it should be for anybody though. The difference between support and misunderstanding, however, can be measured in well-being. But statistics, as important as they are, do not fully capture the emotional cost. Misunderstanding creates loneliness even in crowded rooms. It creates hyper-awareness, the constant scanning of every tone, every posture, and language used to detect whether danger is present or not. It creates exhaustion from explaining yourself over and over, from answering invasive questions framed as curiosity, from defending an existence that should not even require a defense in the first place. There is also the cost of silence. Whenever transgender people see their identities debated with such hostility, many of them choose to retreat. They withhold their stories. They avoid disclosure of any kind. This self-protection is understandable, but it is also quite heavy. To live partially is a tiring thing indeed, people. To censor yourself in every introduction, every new friendship, every official document, it chips away at spontaneity. It replaces ease with cruel calculation. Misunderstanding does not only harm transgender individuals, it completely narrows society as a whole. When we constantly sit there and insist that identity must fit rigid expectations, we limit everybody's freedom to express themselves fully. We are reinforcing the idea that difference is dangerous rather than instructive. Fear thrives in ignorance, but ignorance also thrives in fear. I don't even know if anybody is watching at this point. The minute I said transgender, about 90% of you probably clicked off the video, which harkens back to my point of listening. But if you are still there, I appreciate your support. And I encourage you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Moving on, when communities resist learning about transgender experiences, they often do so because change just feels destabilizing. Gender has long been treated as fixed and binary, woven deeply into cultural traditions and personal identities. The idea that it might be more complex can feel quite unsettling, I imagine. But complexity is not chaos, it is just reality. Things are changing all the time, guys. The cost of misunderstanding, then, is not just emotional distress, it is the loss of total connection. It is the missed opportunity to expand our empathy. It is the unnecessary suffering created when we choose assumption over attention. There are parents out there who later say, with deep regret, "I wish I had listened sooner." There are adults who describe decades spent hiding because the world around them had no language for who they were. There are young people who blossom almost immediately as soon as they're affirmed, as if someone had simply opened a window in a room that had been airless. That transformation reveals something important. That identity itself was never the danger at all. The danger was the isolation. Misunderstanding isolates, understanding connects. The cost of misunderstanding is paid in private tears, in strained family relationships, in classrooms that feel unsafe, in dreams quietly revised downward. It is paid in potential unrealized because energy that could have been used for growth was spent purely on survival. But misunderstanding is not inevitable. It is a choice, sometimes unconscious, sometimes highly defensive, to stop oneself short of any empathy, to remain there at the surface, to debate instead of inquire. If we are willing to ask the deeper questions here, to sit back with a bit of discomfort and just admit uncertainty without turning it into outright dismissal, the cost begins to lessen. Because when someone is finally understood, not perfectly and not even completely, but sincerely, something shifts. The room softens. Shoulders drop in relief. The breath deepens. And the life that once felt contested begins slowly to feel possible and real at last. Somewhere along the way, the existence of transgender people became framed as a mere position, a stance, a side to choose. But identity is not legislation. It is not a fucking campaign strategy. It is not a talking point sharpened for popular debate. It is the quiet knowledge a person carries about themselves long before anyone else is invited inside of it. To understand transgender identity is not to sign onto a political ideology at all. It is to acknowledge a human reality, that each person has an internal sense of who they really are, and that this sense deserves the same respect regardless. Politics enters whenever society decide whose realities will be protected and whose will not. Humanity exists long before that decision is ever made. When a child tells their parent, "This is who I am," that moment is not at all partisan. It is vulnerable. It is intimate. It is frightening and it is hopeful all at the same time. The child is not delivering a speech. They are only offering trust. The response to that trust is what will determine whether the moment becomes a memory of safety or a memory of fracture. Public discourse often pulls transgender identity into abstract territory. Debates about definitions, policies, fairness, fucking tradition. Those particular conversations can matter. Laws shape lives. Systems influence overall safety. But beneath every policy is a person waking up in the morning, choosing their outfit for the day, navigating school hallways, and wondering how they will be addressed at any given moment. Beneath every headline is a family negotiating dinner conversations. Beneath every statistic is a living, breathing heartbeat. Humanity is the very foundation, you guys. When we say that understanding transgender identity is human, we are not dismissing complexity. We are centering our dignity. We are saying that before we argue about structures, we must recognize the individual before me. Every single culture throughout all of history has wrestled with gender in some form or another. But language evolves over time. Roles can shift. Expectations can change. But what has remained constant is this. Human beings seek coherence between their inner world and their outer life. We all want to feel that who we are inside is not at war with how we are seen by everybody else. For transgender people, that coherence often requires a lot of courage. It requires speaking up whenever silence might feel to be the safer option. It requires navigating misunderstanding without losing our self-trust. It requires hoping that others will respond with compassion rather than strict suspicion. None of that is political at its core. It is just profoundly human. I simply understand, almost instinctively so, the harm of forcing somebody to live dishonestly. We would not tell a left-handed child to write their name with their right hand simply because it feels more familiar to the rest of us. We would not ask somebody to deny their heritage to make others around them feel more comfortable. We recognize the quiet damage of suppression in so many areas of our life. Yet, whenever it comes to gender, empathy usually falters for some reason. Perhaps because gender has always been treated as simple for so long. Perhaps it's because change unsettles long-held assumptions. Perhaps it's because admitting that complexity feels like losing a certainty within yourselves. But understanding does not require abandoning everything that we know. It only requires expanding it. Imagine that. Listen to transgender people describe their experiences is not to erase anybody else's. It is to simply add depth to our collective understanding of what it means to be human at all. It is to accept that human experience has always been more varied than rigid categories allow for. When inclusion is framed as political, like it is now, it becomes completely optional at that point, something that is negotiated depending on power and popularity alone. When inclusion is framed as human, it becomes ethical. It becomes rooted in the belief that dignity should not fluctuate based solely on public opinion. This does not mean that every single question has a simple answer, though. There are no simple answers. And it does not mean that conversations about policy are unnecessary. It just means that those conversations must begin from a place of shared from a place of shared humanity rather than outright suspicion. If we start with the assumption that transgender people are problems to solve, then we are already building systems of containment. Whereas if we start with the assumption that being transgender is nothing more than just people being people, complex, variable, and deserving, sure, then we are building systems of care. This distinction is what matters the most. Because when a young person sits in a classroom with a shaking pencil, they are not thinking about political platforms. They are thinking about whether they will be safe or not. Whether their futures include belonging. Those are human questions. And the way that we answer them, whether in our homes or in our schools or in our damn communities, reveals whether we are willing to see beyond the noise of debate to the quieter truth underneath of it. Understanding transgender identity is not about winning an argument. It is about recognizing another person. It is about choosing empathy over fear. It is about acknowledging that authenticity is not a threat to society. It is the foundation of a much healthier one. And when we remember these things, the conversation shifts. It softens as a room might. It deepens as a breath might. It becomes less and less about sides and more about care and compassion. Less about ideology and more about dignity. Less about fucking politics and more about living, breathing people. And that, my friends, will be it for this one. Like I said, I'm going to turn this into a series. This is all based on a book that I wrote called Invisible No More. There is a link to that on Amazon in the description if you're interested in reading this for yourself, sharing it with others, whatever. Like I said going into this thing, I'm not here to win any arguments. I'm not here to start a culture war. I'm not here to pick a side. I'm just simply explaining why this stuff matters so much and trying to show people that affirmation is not a negative thing. Being transgender is not a negative thing. Transgender people are some of the most beautiful people in the world, inside and out in most cases. And I just want to bring light and attention to that in our world of darkness. Because there are a lot of people out there who claim that they know what they're talking about, and they really don't. Samantha Rose, signing off.